Can I call my mom? Can I call my mom?
24 doorbell clips, 7 levels. I've spent hours going through doorbell camera archives and compiled the most disturbing footage into this iceberg. We'll start with the uncomfortable and gradually uncover footage so disturbing you'll think twice before opening your door. So let's start at the tip of this iceberg. Level 1. Sunday in Lindenhurst. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in North Lindenhurst, Long Island, when suddenly a loud, roaring noise interrupted the peace. A home's Ring doorbell camera caught what happened next. The footage showed a small plane flying dangerously low, barely clearing the rooftops as it struggled to stay in the air. Within seconds, it disappeared behind a line of trees near the Long Island Railroad tracks, and a massive fireball erupted. As a result, thick black smoke rose into the sky. The homeowner whose camera recorded the explosion later said he heard the engine sputtering before the impact. At first, he thought it was just a car backfiring, but minutes later, his fire department pager confirmed it wasn't a car at all. When he stepped outside, he could see the smoke climbing into the sky. The aircraft had crashed near 5th Street and North Wellwood Avenue, coming to a rest just a few hundred feet from the LIRR tracks. When emergency responders got to the wreckage, one person had already lost their life. 2 others were pulled from the debris with third-degree burns and airlifted to a nearby hospital in critical condition. Thankfully, nobody on the ground was hurt. Later investigators identified the aircraft as a Piper PA-28, and there was a reason it had been flying so low. Just before the crash, the pilot had radioed Republic Airport with a mayday call reporting smoke inside the cockpit. Apparently, the aircraft had been trying to reach the airport for an emergency landing, but it ran out of time before it ran out of sky. The test drive. Selling a car online usually means meeting strangers at your home, but what happened in Mississauga, Canada in 2024 showed just how dangerous that can be. A homeowner had listed his 2022 Porsche Cayenne for sale on AutoTrader, and a woman showed up around 2 p.m. that afternoon to take a look. His doorbell camera captured her walking up to the porch wearing a white off-the-shoulder top and glasses. She rang the doorbell and politely introduced herself, saying that she was there for the Porsche and waiting for her father to arrive before inspecting it. Nothing about the interaction seemed aggressive, so the owner brought her to the driveway and let her look at the SUV. He stood beside the vehicle while she sat in the driver's seat, asking questions and checking the interior. But the moment he moved away from the driver's side, she slammed the SUV into reverse and hit the gas. The open driver's side door struck him and knocked him to the pavement. But instead of stopping, she kept reversing, and the vehicle rolled over him as he tried to move out of the way. He managed to get back on his feet, clutching his back as he stumbled toward the driver's window to confront her. However, she shifted into drive and sped out of the driveway while a gray vehicle followed closely behind her, suggesting this wasn't spontaneous. The owner later reported that he required medical attention as he suffered injuries to his hands, elbows, and legs. Meanwhile, after the footage went viral, the suspect, an 18-year-old woman, turned herself in to Peel Regional Police. She was charged with dangerous operation causing bodily harm, theft of a motor vehicle, and fleeing from police. What started as a simple car listing almost cost the owner his life. The rent dispute. On January 12, 2020, a landlord arrived at his property in Corona, Queens to collect overdue rent. But he didn't expect what happened next. The landlord, 71-year-old Edgar Moncayo, walked up to the front door and stood at the top of the stoop around 2:30 in the afternoon. He rang the doorbell while talking on his cell phone. As he waited, he could be seen trying to open the door, but someone on the other side was resisting keeping it shut. The situation quickly escalated as Moncayo applied more force to the door. That's when the tenant came out of the doorway and shoved Moncayo with brutal force. As a result, the elderly man tumbled down all 8 brick steps and slammed headfirst into the concrete sidewalk below. After that, he went completely still. Moments later, the tenant and a friend who'd been inside came down the stairs. They walked right past Moncayo's motionless body lying on the pavement, but his friend stopped and leaned over to check on him. The friend started pacing anxiously and took off his hat, clearly realizing how serious the situation was. Eventually, Moncayo was rushed to the hospital, but lost his life from the traumatic head injury. Investigators later identified the tenant as 22-year-old Alex Garces. He had moved in recently but was already behind on rent, which Moncayo showed up that day to collect. When police arrested Garces the next day, he initially claimed the whole thing was an accident, saying he was moving a mattress when Moncayo got hit by the door. However, when investigators reviewed the doorbell footage, that version immediately fell apart. The video clearly showed him shoving the landlord. As a result, he was charged with manslaughter, and in May 2020, he accepted a plea deal and admitted to the shove. 2 months later, he was sentenced to 3 years in prison, followed by post-release supervision. Level 2. Parking spot dispute. A doorbell camera in an apartment complex in Hialeah, Florida captured a moment a dispute over a parking spot turned deadly. The footage showed a man walking out of his apartment with his hand hidden inside a plastic bag. He walked straight to his neighbor's door and knocked, waiting for someone to answer. When no one came right away, he turned and started walking back toward his own apartment. But moments later, the door opened, and that's when everything went wrong. The man approached the doorway and in one quick motion pulled a gun from the bag and fired at the person standing there. A second camera angle showed there had actually been 2 men at the door, but the bullet only hit one. Minutes later, the police arrived to find the victim already dead. They later identified him as 31-year-old Yondres Campos. As for the shooter, investigators identified him as 55-year-old Pedro Blanco, who lived in the neighboring unit. The evidence was clear because the entire thing had been recorded by Blanco's own doorbell camera. Ultimately, police arrested him and charged him with first degree. It turned out the shooting stemmed from an ongoing dispute between Blanco and his neighbor. However, there was a devastating twist. Campos wasn't actually the neighbor Blanco had been feuding with. He was just visiting his friend and happened to answer the door. The garage standoff. Police responded to a neighbor dispute in Windham Township, Ohio on May 14, 2022, expecting a routine call. Instead, it unfolded into something far more serious. Dashcam footage showed a Portage County Sheriff's deputy pulling into a gravel driveway and stepping out of his cruiser. As he walked toward the house, he spotted a woman standing just inside her neighbor's open garage with a revolver in her hand. He immediately started shouting for her to drop it, but the woman didn't listen. Since she was still armed, the officers kept their distance and repeated their commands. "Drop it now, you will be shot." They said it again and again. Still, the woman didn't comply. Instead, she turned and walked deeper into the garage, moving between 2 parked vehicles. The movement blocked the camera's view, but the audio kept recording. And in the next moment, 15 shots were heard in rapid succession. When the view cleared, the woman was on the ground at the back beneath a workbench. Officers rushed in, handcuffed her, and started applying pressure to her wounds while radioing for help. 4 minutes later, she was transported to the hospital, but died from her injuries. Investigators later identified her as 66-year-old Cora Baumann. Earlier that morning, she had walked into her neighbor's garage with the revolver. According to the 911 call, the neighbor reported that she was pointing the gun at him and trying to enter his home. Ultimately, the use of force was ruled objectively reasonable because Baumann had refused to drop the weapon despite repeated warnings. West Drayton Incident. A Ring camera in West Drayton captured what started as two men walking down a quiet residential street before everything went wrong. The footage showed the man on the sidewalk when a white van pulled up beside them. They got in, and the van moved forward a short distance before stopping. The lights went out for a moment, which seemed odd, but when they came back on, a scuffle had already broken out inside. The two men who'd gotten in scrambled back out, dragging the passenger with them as the fight spilled onto the street. The struggle continued outside, but the footage was grainy and it was hard to see exactly what was happening. Suddenly, a woman burst out of a nearby house and started screaming at them to get out of there. The two men immediately ran off, leaving the passenger lying on the ground. The woman rushed over to check on him, but as soon as she got close, she started screaming, "They stabbed him," and ran back toward her house to get help. The clip spread quickly on Facebook Reels because it was part of a series of violent incidents that had been happening in the area. Just weeks earlier, a 49-year-old dog walker had been fatally stabbed in Uxbridge, leading to the arrest and charge of a 22-year-old Afghan national. Around the same time, a man in his 20s was also stabbed, while a teenage boy was left with serious head injuries in a separate incident. Despite the Ring recording, the attackers have never been identified, and no arrests have been made. The Pool Party Ambush. On May 28, 2024, what started as a gathering at the Villages of Lakeshore Community Pool in Richland County turned into something completely different. Around 8 p.m., about 80 juveniles were hanging out in the parking lot near the pool. Suddenly, groups of people started scattering in every direction as gunfire erupted. The shots came fast, over and over, as multiple shooters opened fire. Bullets hit nearby homes and vehicles as the shooting continued. In just 22 seconds, over 75 shots were fired. When deputies arrived, the shooters had already jumped into cars and sped off while others ran on foot, some still holding weapons. Officers started chasing suspects who were fleeing the scene, eventually catching one teenager named Treshawn Keller running with a gun. Meanwhile, in the middle of the chaos, a teenage boy had been hit and was rushed to the hospital. As investigators reviewed the doorbell footage, they realized the attack wasn't random. The cameras showed that vehicles had been strategically positioned around the parking lot before the shooting began, indicating the whole thing had been planned. Not to mention, the shooters used illegally modified weapons, including pistols with Glock switches that turned them into automatic guns. Eventually, authorities were able to track down additional suspects, and 3 firearms were recovered. Keller faces charges including aggravated breach of peace, possession of a stolen pistol, unlawful possession of a machine gun, and assault and battery. His bond was denied. It turns out this was the second shooting that had happened in that same area in the last year. Now, if you thought the clips so far were disturbing, let me warn you, the next levels are much darker territory. So subscribe and let's continue. Level 3, Richard Roselle Drive. It was a quiet night on Richard Roselle Drive in Charlotte, North Carolina, until 2 cars pulled onto the street. The cars were a light-colored sedan and a dark SUV, and they crept up in front of a home and stopped. The next moment, about 2 people got out of the car and opened fire. For 12 straight seconds, they fired nearly 150 rounds into the house. Bullets tore through walls, windows, and doors as muzzle flashes lit up the street. The people kept firing while standing in the street before they finally jumped back in the cars and sped off. A neighbor's doorbell camera captured the entire attack from start to finish, but what it didn't show was what was happening inside the house. It turned out named Azia Figueroa was sleeping in his bed when he became a victim of the incident. His sister was also grazed, but she survived. Later on, investigators determined the attack was tied to a high school rivalry that had been going on for months. DNA evidence and cell phone GPS data placed several suspects at the scene, allowing police to make arrests. Eventually, 2 suspects were caught. Jacob Lanier, one of the primary shooters, pleaded guilty to the crime in October 2025 and was sentenced to over 22 years in prison. The second suspect, Quatonio Stevens, was charged with accessory to the crime. 2-hour standoff. Police pulled up to West Wanda Drive in Garland after multiple 911 calls reported gunshots in the area. However, they didn't expect what they would meet when they arrived. As soon as the cruiser stopped, a man immediately opened fire on them. The officers couldn't even get out of their cars before bullets started hitting the vehicles. One round went straight through a car door and hit an officer in both legs, leaving him trapped inside while the shooting continued. Moments later, the gunman ran to a white pickup truck and took off. Another doorbell camera caught him speeding through the neighborhood with police following behind. He then stopped at the end of a cul-de-sac, got out, and started shooting at the officers again. In response, the cops fired back, and the standoff dragged on for nearly 2 hours with over 100 rounds fired between the suspect and 8 officers. Eventually, he ran on foot to a relative's home back on West Wanda Drive. Police were able to get the family members out safely and tried to get him to surrender, but he refused. Instead, he charged out of the house and pointed a gun at the officers. So multiple officers fired back in response, hitting him. He was then taken to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Later, the shooter was identified as 23-year-old Bernardo Mares Jr., and witnesses said he'd told people earlier that night he wasn't going to jail and would force police to end his life. As for the officer who'd been shot in both legs, he was rushed to the hospital and expected to make a full recovery. Meanwhile, all 8 officers involved were placed on leave while the investigation continued. The icy alleyway. On February 13, 2025, what should have been a routine police response turned into a deadly ambush. The doorbell footage shows a dark alleyway between a building and a white fence that night. 2 figures suddenly appear running through the narrow path. They're obviously running from the police, and for a moment it looks like they're trapped. Suddenly, one of them quickly climbs over the fence and disappears, but the other doesn't. He stops, turns around, and takes a shooting stance. A red laser dot appears as he raises his gun and points it at the approaching officer. Muzzle flashes light up the alley as he fires multiple shots, 7 rounds in total. But as he's firing, his feet slip on the ice beneath him, throwing off his aim. Earlier that evening, police responded to reports of attempted carjackings in the Town Plot neighborhood. The suspects had been trying to steal cars at gunpoint, and officers tracked them to a residence on Claremont Street based on tips from residents. The pursuing officer was Detective Ronald Sackett. His body camera showed him rounding the corner when the suspect suddenly stepped out from the shadows on the opposite side with a gun raised. Before he could react, the suspect opened fire, causing Sackett to stumble and fall face down. Immediately, Sackett radioed for help, saying he'd been hit. Then, he pulled out his gun and fired back 4 times, but none of them hit the suspect, so he fled the scene immediately. However, he was caught and arrested shortly after by other officers in the area. Meanwhile, Sackett was rushed to Waterbury Hospital and released the next day. The suspect was identified as 20-year-old Arian Perez Feliciano. He was charged with attempted assault on a police officer and weapons charges. The hostage situation. On a snowy afternoon in North Olmsted, Ohio, a woman stepped out of her apartment with her 2 young sons, unaware that a desperate man was seconds away from her door. The doorbell footage showed her son stepping out first, but before she could follow, a man suddenly came running holding a gun. He pointed it at her and ordered her to get back inside, leaving her kids standing outside alone while sirens grew louder in the distance. Approximately 10 seconds later, an officer came sprinting into frame, screaming at the boys to move out of the way. He reached the door and kicked it open. Moments later, gunshots rang out from inside the apartment. So how did a random mother and her kids end up as hostages in their own home? It started earlier that day when a man robbed a Brinks truck driver at gunpoint in Elyria. As a result, police began chasing him through multiple cities, eventually deploying spike strips at Columbia and Brook Park roads to stop his car. But instead of surrendering, he jumped out and ran straight into the nearest apartment complex on Clairshire Drive. The woman and her 2 sons were the first people he encountered. So when the pursuing officer reached the apartment, he kicked the door open and came face to face with the suspect still holding the woman at gunpoint. He fired, hitting the suspect in the head and torso. The man was rushed to the hospital under guard but was pronounced dead shortly after. As for the woman and her children, they were all rescued safely without a single injury. The suspect was later identified as 37-year-old John Johnson from Lorraine, and police recovered his gun inside the apartment and the stolen cash back in his abandoned car. Level 4. Before sunrise. It was a dark and quiet night at a Northwest Austin apartment complex until a Ring doorbell camera captured what was only the beginning of a long and violent morning. At 3:38 a.m. on November 7, 2024, an orange Ford Ranger pulled into a parking lot and stopped abruptly. Then, a masked man stepped out with a shotgun and walked straight to one of the doors. Without hesitation, he kicked it in, disappearing inside for a brief moment, then returned to the truck and drove off. That scene, however, was already a continuation of something that had happened way earlier. About 30 minutes before the break-in, Bee Cave police had spotted the same orange truck speeding erratically on the highway. Immediately, they initiated a traffic stop, but instead of complying, he suddenly accelerated and even drove the wrong way through traffic. Because the risk to other drivers was too high, officers ended the pursuit and alerted Austin police. Not long after, the truck appeared at the apartment complex. After that, at around 4:42 a.m., he approached a woman at a Starbucks with a gun and stole her vehicle. Less than 2 hours later, he repeated the same act at a nearby parking lot, taking another man's car at gunpoint. By mid-morning, August police received a tip that he might be returning to the apartment complex, so officers from the Violent Crimes Task Force positioned themselves nearby and waited. When he showed up, they ordered him to the ground, but he ran instead, so a detective gave chase. When the detective closed in, the man turned and pointed a handgun directly at him. In response, all 3 officers fired, hitting him multiple times. Ultimately, he was pronounced dead at 9:03 a.m. The man was later identified as 27-year-old Zachary Labrie. He had been released from jail just 9 days earlier, and the apartment he had forced entry into belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who had already left town because of prior violence involving him. All 4 officers involved were placed on administrative leave while investigators reviewed the shooting. However, in February 2026, a grand jury cleared all 4 of them, ruling their actions were not unlawful. The attempted break-in. On September 20th, 2025, a woman named Anna Scott pulled into her driveway and noticed 3 men at her front door. Just after 10:30 p.m., Anna's doorbell camera captured 3 men in hoodies approaching the front door of her home in Citation Drive in Decatur, Georgia. One crouched down at the lock with a tool in his hand while the others waited. But before they could get inside, headlights swept across the driveway as Anna's Jeep pulled up. She stopped just inches from the porch. The moment the men saw her car, they panicked and started running. But as they fled, one of them turned and raised his gun, firing multiple rounds directly into her Jeep. The attack happened in seconds, leaving no time to reverse or escape. As a result, Anna was hit inside her own driveway. Neighbors heard the shots and rushed her to the hospital, but she died from her injuries. Investigators believe Anna had seen the break-in alert on her doorbell app while she was out and had driven home to confront them, which meant she had walked straight into danger without knowing how serious it was. Later on, the police released the footage publicly and asked anyone who recognized the three men to come forward. As a result, tips flooded in, and by October 2025, investigators had tracked down one of the suspects, 33-year-old Markel Hurd in Birmingham, Alabama. He was charged with felony and attempted burglary, while the other two remained at large. The home invasion. In Richmond Heights, Florida, a man and his elderly mother were settling in for the night when they heard a commotion outside. The man grabbed his gun and stepped out of his front door to find 4 uninvited men on his porch. He told them to leave, but they didn't, so he slowly backed toward his door, trying to get back inside. But before he could close it, one of the men charged straight at him and forced his way through. A nearby camera pointed at the street captured what happened next. You couldn't see the porch from the angle, but you could hear everything. 2 shots rang out, followed by the shouting of the man who had been hit. Miami-Dade Fire Rescue arrived shortly after and rushed the suspect to the hospital. The homeowner and his mother were both unharmed. The suspect was later identified as 26-year-old Quantry Alvin Whitley. He died from his injuries at the hospital. The remaining 3 suspects fled and were still at large as investigators asked the public for help locating them. In the days that followed, the homeowner described it as the worst night of his life. He said he never intended for anyone to die, but once the door was forced open, he believed he had no other option.
As I'm coming to go in the house, he charges at me. He comes inside right after me. So I shot 2 times, and I wish it never happened.
However, Whitley's mother refused to believe her son had anything to do with the home invasion, saying the person being described simply wasn't the son she knew. Ultimately, investigators confirmed it was an attempted home invasion, and the homeowner was not charged. In broad daylight. On January 22, 2026, a neighbor's surveillance camera in Jacksonville, Florida, captured 3 masked men walking toward a house on 6th Avenue, and what they were about to do would leave the entire street in shock. The footage showed them walking briskly down the street with their faces covered. As soon as they disappeared from view, the street exploded with gunfire. Shots rang out in rapid bursts, so fast and loud that neighbors later said it sounded like automatic fire. The volume was intense enough to trigger the fire alarm inside the house. Another neighbor watching her own surveillance app saw 2 of the men running through her yard to get away. She realized her front door was unlocked, so she rushed to close and lock it as the men fled past. The 3rd man never made it out. When officers arrived, they found him outside on the front lawn. He had been shot and had crawled out before collapsing. Just steps away, inside a car parked in front of the house, they located the homeowner, also wounded. Later, investigators pieced together what had happened inside. Apparently, the 3 suspects had forced entry into the home and opened fire on the resident. However, the homeowner returned fire. As a result, one of the intruders was struck, which disrupted the escape and left him behind while the other 2 fled. Both the homeowner and the injured suspect were transported to the hospital in stable condition. By the following day, the 2 remaining suspects were still at large, and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office asked the public for information to help track them down. The Philhurst Incident. On the evening of May 31, 2025, Baldwin Park police responded to calls of a man firing a rifle in a residential neighborhood. But what they found when they arrived was far worse. A nearby Ring doorbell camera captured the sound of more than a dozen gunshots erupting in rapid succession. The audio was chaotic, with shots ringing out for over 10 seconds straight as officers exchanged fire with the suspect. Another angle showed officers running toward the gunfire while more shots continued to echo through the street. The incident began earlier at around 7:12 p.m. A man had just parked his car on Philhurst Avenue and was walking when he was shot by the suspect. The man tried to run but was struck multiple times and collapsed in the street. 4 minutes later, police officers arrived at the scene, but the moment they pulled up, The suspect, armed with an AR-15 style rifle, immediately opened fire on them. They didn't even have time to react. As a result, one of the officers, named Samuel Riveros, was struck and went down. At the same time, a round tore through the windshield, sending glass and debris into another officer named Anthony Pimentel, injuring him. Subsequently, other officers returned fire, and a gunfight ensued until finally the suspect was hit and taken into custody. At the end of it, both officers were rushed to a nearby medical center. Officer Riveros was pronounced dead on arrival, while Officer Pimentel was stabilized. Later investigators recovered the AR-15 style rifle, high-capacity magazines, and between 40 and 60 spent casings from the scene. The victim was later identified as Darius Wong, a 43-year-old father of two who had no connection to the suspect. He was simply in the wrong place when the shooting started. As for the suspect, he was identified as 22-year-old Eduardo Roberto Medina Berumen. On June 3rd, he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree, 2 counts of attempted of a peace officer, and possession of an assault weapon. He pleaded not guilty and faces either life without parole or the death penalty if convicted. Level 5. The medical flight. A man stood on his porch in northeast Philadelphia waving goodbye to a guest on a snowy January night when a bright light suddenly filled the sky above him. His doorbell camera recorded the moment. It showed a small jet dropping out of the darkness at a steep angle, nose down, falling fast. Before anyone could process what they were seeing, it slammed into the street just down the block and exploded on impact. The fireball shot up 50 feet high, lighting up the entire neighborhood. Debris flew in every direction, and a piece of the plane bounced and landed near the man's yard. The crash happened on January 31st, 2025, around 11:45 at night near Roosevelt Boulevard and Harbison Avenue. The aircraft was a medical jet that had just taken off from Northeast Philadelphia Airport about 1.5 minutes earlier. On board were 6 people, 2 pilots, 2 crew members, a young girl who had just received treatment, and her mother. They were heading back to Missouri. All 6 of them lost their lives on impact. On the ground, more than 40 others were injured, and about 50 residents were forced to evacuate. Additionally, 4 homes were destroyed and more than 10 others were damaged. 5 vehicles caught fire and power lines were knocked down, cutting electricity to over 1,000 residents. By May 2025, the death toll had risen to 8 after 2 more victims succumbed to their injuries. Later investigators reviewed the black box data and found that it was never recording to begin with. As a result, the cause of the crash is not yet known. A house in Bethel. A neighbor's doorbell camera in Bethel, Ohio was running on a quiet Tuesday morning, but what it recorded in the next few seconds would shock the entire neighborhood. The footage from November 19, 2024 shows a quiet residential street at 9:01 a.m. However, in the next moment, the house suddenly explodes. The entire structure lifts off its foundation for a split second before it tears apart in a massive fireball with a deafening sound. The roof and walls blow outward in every direction as huge chunks of wood, insulation, and furniture fly through the air. Seconds later, flames erupt from what's left of the foundation as thick black smoke climbs into the sky. Meanwhile, neighbors heard the explosion from blocks away and immediately called 911. And when fire crews arrived, they found a man stumbling out of the wreckage covered in soot with severe burns across 30% of his body. He was barely able to breathe, so paramedics airlifted him to a local hospital immediately. 2 hours later, firefighters were finally able to put out the flames, but it took additional hours to search through the rubble. Later that afternoon, they found 2 bodies and pronounced them dead at the scene. The victims were 77-year-old Barry Stone, who owned the home, and 52-year-old Helen Evans. Eventually, investigators discovered that an HVAC repairman had arrived around 9 a.m. to work on the propane furnace in the house's basement. But while he was working, propane started leaking and silently building up inside the sealed house. Something sparked it, whether it was his tools, a light switch, or the furnace's pilot light, and the gas ignited. The explosion was so powerful that it leveled the entire structure in seconds, but somehow the repairman managed to use a fallen beam to crawl out of the house. He was later reported to be in stable condition. At the end of it all, the explosion was ruled accidental, and no criminal charges were filed. Level 6. The parking lot. A family settling in for the night at their apartment in Decatur, Georgia, had no idea that their doorbell camera was about to capture something horrifying. The footage started at around 10:30 p.m. on April 18, 2025. It showed multiple people surrounding one man yelling at him. The man was 33-year-old Darian Hambrick, who stood his ground as the group pressed in closer. Suddenly, shots rang out. Hambrick dropped to the ground face first and didn't move. After that, one of the cars pulled forward and ran over his body before speeding off. The whole group scattered, leaving Hambrick lying in the parking lot. Police arrived and found him unresponsive, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. Later, investigators reviewed the doorbell footage and identified the shooter as 21-year-old Mikkel Harris, who was the father of two of Hambrick's nieces or nephews. Harris had shown up that night demanding to take the children, which sparked the confrontation. Police arrested him on May 16th and charged him with But 2 months later, the DeKalb County District's Attorney Office dropped old charges against Harris. After reviewing the doorbell footage and the full circumstances, they determined the shooting was self-defense under Georgia law. As a result, Harris was released from jail on June 13th. Hambrick's family pushed back, pointing out that the footage clearly showed a group of people surrounding him before he was shot. His mother said he lost his life protecting the family and believed more people should have been charged. But despite all of that, no additional arrests were made. Please call my mom.
Can I call my mom, please?
Those were the words a homeowner in Abilene, Texas woke up to at 2:45 in the morning on October 5th, 2024. Their Ring camera captured the moment the man, who was shirtless, stumbled up to the porch with his hands covered in blood. He started pounding on the door with both fists, ringing the doorbell over and over while crying out desperately. "Help! Help me!" he screamed. "Call my mom. Please call my mom." His voice kept breaking as he sobbed. After about 20 seconds of pleading with no answer, he backed away and disappeared into the night. The homeowner, Brittany Pierce, and her husband woke up to the noise. Her husband called 911 while getting dressed, but they didn't open the door because of all the blood. And the man left before police arrived, leaving behind blood stains all over their front door. When the officers finally arrived, they told her they didn't need anything from her and to just clean the door. But the footage had already been shared, and it was spreading fast. Earlier that same night, police had responded to reports of a stabbing at a nearby apartment complex. Someone had broken a beer bottle during an argument and used the sharp pieces to slash multiple people, leaving them with serious injuries. The attacker had fled before officers arrived. So when investigators saw the doorbell footage, they connected it to the previous apartment footage. Apparently, the man covered in blood wasn't a victim looking for help. He was the suspect running from what he'd just done. 2 days later, on October 7th, Abilene police identified the boy as Christian David Orozco and arrested him. He was charged with burglary of a habitation and aggravated assault from the stabbings. Investigators also linked him to a similar violent incident from September 15th at a home on Poplar Street. Ultimately, his total bond was set at $400,000. The wrong house. A man sitting in his living room watching TV on a quiet afternoon in Stanley, County Durham, had no idea 3 strangers were walking up to his front door. It was around 5:20 p.m. on April 5th, 2025. 2 men walked into frame from the left, heading straight for the house. One of them, wearing black, stepped forward and picked up a brick. He threw it hard through the living room window, shattering the glass completely. Before anyone inside could react, another man in a white hoodie moved up to the broken window, pulled out a gun, and fired a single shot through the hole. The bang echoed down the street like a firecracker, but louder. From inside the house, a voice screamed, "They've shot my dad! They've shot my dad!" Immediately, the 3 men turned and ran, sprinting back the way they came and disappearing out of frame. The whole thing lasted less than 30 seconds. The man inside was identified as 60-year-old Barry Dawson, a grandfather who had lived in that house for over 20 years. He'd been sitting down enjoying his tea when the shot went through the window and hit him in the chest. As a result, he died at the scene before paramedics could help him. After reviewing the doorbell footage, the shooter was identified as 30-year-old Sean Rie. He fled to Scotland and later to Ireland, but police arrested him in Belfast 5 days later. The other 2 men, 38-year-old Kelvin Lawson, who threw the brick, and 22-year-old Thomas Sterling, who acted as lookout, were arrested locally within 2 days. Later, investigators found out that earlier that day, Rie had been threatened outside his own home over a related dispute. Instead of going to the police, he decided to take revenge himself. So he recruited Lawson and Sterling and grabbed a gun. They drove to what they thought was the threatener's house on Elm Street, but they had the wrong address. Barry Dawson had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. Eventually, in October 2025, all 3 men were found guilty of the crime. Rie was sentenced to life with a minimum of 32 years, Lawson got 28 years, and Sterling got 26 years. 3 other people who helped them cover up the crime by burning the getaway car and filing false reports were also sentenced to prison. A son's visit. In 2025, a woman in Frostproof, Florida opened the door to welcome her son home, but things would quickly go sideways. The young man walked up the driveway, knocked on the door, and rang the doorbell several times, waiting. However, the second the woman opened the door, he forced his way past and began attacking her. No one knew what happened next until 15 minutes later when police received a call from the same young man. He told the operator he had just taken a life. When deputies arrived, the man was strangely cooperative and was arrested without any resistance. Police identified him as Emmanuel Espinoza, a 21-year-old pre-med student at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He had driven about 2 hours from campus to his mother's home in Frostproof unannounced. Later, when investigators reviewed the ring footage, they noticed that Emmanuel had been holding a pocket knife in his right hand the entire time. He kept it hidden behind his back as he approached the door. And separate footage showed him washing blood off his hands and arms in the kitchen sink afterward. Inside the house, he had stabbed his mother, Elvia Espinoza, over 70 times, causing her to lose her life at the scene. During questioning, he told detectives he had decided during the drive that he was going to end her life because she got on his nerves. He even admitted he knew exactly where to attack her for maximum effect because he had learned it in his pre-med biology classes. Ultimately, he was charged with first-degree premeditated and held without bond. He pleaded not guilty, and his case is still ongoing. Level 7, The Visitor. On a sunny April evening, a man in North Ogden opened his door to greet someone he knew, unaware of their true intentions. It was around 7:11 p.m. when a visitor walked up to the front door and rang the bell. When the man opened the door, the visitor asked to see their mother, but the man responded that she was in Missouri and had been there for about a year. The visitor nodded, calmly reached into his sweatshirt pocket, and pulled out a gun. Before the man could react, he fired 5 shots straight through the doorway. The man collapsed as the visitor forced his way inside and kept firing. Screaming could be heard from inside the house. A few minutes later, the same man walked back out to his brown van parked in the driveway. He pulled out a shotgun and a brown duffel bag, slung the gun over his shoulder, and walked back into the house. A neighbor heard the gunshots and called 911 around 7:15 p.m., and 5 minutes later the police arrived. But as they pulled up, the man came rushing back out of the burning house with his gun and started firing at them. In response, 3 officers fired back, shooting 59 rounds total. Eventually, the man was hit in the head and collapsed on the front steps. Police body cameras captured flames and thick black smoke pouring out of the first-floor windows, indicating he had set the house on fire before confronting officers. Investigators later identified the visitor as Jeffrey Roberts, a 66-year-old from Long Beach, California. The man who answered the door was his brother, Scott Roberts, also 66. Scott lost his life instantly at the doorway. His wife, who was inside, was shot but managed to escape and survived. It turned out that Jeffrey had driven 730 miles from California with a 9mm handgun and 23 fully loaded magazines. Police found a letter he'd written accusing Scott and other family members of manipulating their elderly mother who had dementia to change her will and cut him out of the estate. And friends said he'd called them before the trip, angry about being excluded. At the end of it all, the Weber County Force investigation team ruled that the officers' use of force was justified. Later on, Scott's daughter posted online that her father died a hero because he fought Jeffrey and yelled for Jody to run, which saved her life. The Block Party. It started as a typical 4th of July celebration in Philadelphia's Grays Ferry neighborhood, but it ended in a way no one could have expected. People were standing around talking, music was playing, and the street was packed with partygoers enjoying the night. But suddenly, bright flashes lit up the darkness as gunfire erupted from multiple directions. People immediately dropped to the ground, diving behind parked cars and crawling along the sidewalk as bullets flew past them. Screams filled the air as more and more guns were pulled out, creating crossfire that went in every direction. The shooting lasted for what felt like forever, with over 100 shots fired in rapid succession. But it was actually only about 20 to 40 seconds. The party had started earlier that night, and around 200 to 300 people had gathered for an unsanctioned celebration after the 4th of July weekend. Police were already in the area responding to noise complaints when the shooting broke out just before 1 a.m. According to investigators, one person fired a single shot, and this triggered what they called contagious gunfire, where everyone else started shooting without even knowing who they were aiming at or why. When the smoke cleared, 3 men had lost their lives while 10 others were injured. Police arrived within minutes and secured the scene, but the shooters had already fled. However, using the Ring doorbell footage, detectives were able to identify the suspects based on their clothing and faces. By August 2025, police had arrested 4 suspects, including 1 juvenile. And in January 2026, a judge ruled there was enough evidence to charge them with third-degree murder and recklessly endangering others. These doorbell cameras captured horror right at people's front doors. But if you want to see the disturbing stories that unfolded anonymously online, watch the most disturbing 4chan threads, Iceberg.